Tonight on Nation to Nation, Indigenous communications expert says Donald Trump may have paused his tariffs for 90 days, but the issue will continue to dominate the election campaign.
Because at the end of the day, you can't trust Donald Trump and his word and what he's going to do.
The Canadian Pollster says the NDP is polling slightly higher in this campaign amongst Indigenous voters, and Manitoba's popular premier might have something to do with it.
There's a Wab Canoe factor, certainly among voters in Manitoba. He's very, very popular.
Because of funding cuts, a supervised consumption site in Ottawa had to close. Its CEO says this leaves many in the community vulnerable to an illicit toxic drug supply.
There is a drug supply that is unregulated, that is unknown, that is poisonous.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. The 2025 federal election has reached the halfway point, and 2.5 weeks, voters will head to the polls to cast their ballots on April 28th. Compared to previous campaigns, this has been a very little discussion of Indigenous issues, as the threat of the Trump tariffs and annexation has eclipsed everything else. Joining me today to talk about it all is Cam Holmstrom, the founder and principal of Nipa Way Strategies, an Indigenous-owned government and public relations firm. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you so much, Fraser.
All right, so prior to starting this business, I noticed that you did work on the Hill for many years before you started this company. Did you ever foresee such a swing, I guess, with the polls, the Liberals, looking sort of like they were out of it just a few months ago, and now they're, in the lead and could form a majority?
Well, Fraser, in my time on Parliament Hill, my decade there, I worked in the NDP caucus, and I lived through 2011. I was working a campaign in Thunder Bay at the beginning of that campaign. I remember when we were sitting in third place, we were sinking in the polls. I was wondering if I was going to have a job after all of it. And then a debate happened, Jack happened, and before I knew it, we were thinking about, oh my God, we could be in government. So it happens. I know it's not the norm, but it happens. But even with the current times that we're in, it's a little jarring to see it, but it's also not shocking to me, just because of the moment that we're in and what people are being asked to make their decisions based on. I think the threat from Trump and all of his pushes towards Canada has forced people to do a rethink about what it is their priority at this point. And I think that's forced it into a different lens. Add to it the fact that so much of our politics now is built around our leaders. When you pull a big piece out like a Justin Trudeau, who was well-known and unliked and all of that, and then you drop in someone with a much different background set, experience set than Mark Carney, it's naturally going to force people to reevaluate. Then when you add on top of that what exactly we're facing, and again, what people are worried about, it then just realigns things all together. So I have empathy for the parties that have been planning for 2 years, which for an election they thought that was going to happen, and all of a sudden it's not that. But this is how it is, and this is where people, some of my former colleagues and people in that space, this is what they get paid to do, to try to figure this out.
Right. Yeah, and I guess they're running out of time to do that, because we're kind of it's a short campaign, so we'll have to see what happens. But aside from Donald Trump, I know that's of course what he's doing is dominating things, but one of the things of Justin Trudeau, that he was unpopular, as you say, before he left, but he did make reconciliation kind of a key part of his agenda. Do you see that now, that Indigenous issues, maybe with neither the Conservatives or the Liberals really not talking very much about reconciliation anymore, do you see that it may not be quite as major of a focus, whoever forms the next government?
I can see how it's come off the table in the sense that it's not been a part of the conversation, because Mr. Trump has taken up so much of the oxygen in the room. It's made it hard to talk about other things. But I'll just point out that in this campaign, there's been a lot of policy agreement. But for a lot of those agreements, you cannot go back to the days where you didn't have us at the table and didn't have us part of the conversation. We've seen both Mr. Carney and Mr. Polliev come out with policies on energy corridors or resources corridors. Well, there's no way that you're going to be able to do that without having rights holders at the table and being a part of it. And I think that if they are thinking that because of this moment of emergency, they can just push aside what the courts have said, what UNDRIP has said, all the progress we've made, I believe they're sorely mistaken, and they're going to find out the hard way that they cannot just go and do that. So I don't think the conversation has been right up front as explicit as it has been in the past. But let's just be honest. You're not doing these things if you do not have our peoples, the rights holders and the communities on side. So that's still something you're going to have to do. And I wish that honestly, more of those leaders were not glossing over that at this point about how it is they're going to get there, because there is no magic wand they can wave to say, poof, we can ignore this now.
Right, and just looking at the leaders and Mark Carney specifically, obviously he's strong on the economic issues, but hasn't seemed so strong on Indigenous issues either. He, when asked, he doesn't want to really talk about it. He's made a couple gaffes. Went to Winnipeg, didn't meet with any Indigenous leaders at all, and made some mistakes when he was up in Nunavut. Is that concerning to you as to what the future holds if the Liberals do form government?
It's concerning if it continues on this path. I still remember when Mr. Layton passed away and Mr. Mulcair rose to become the NDP leader. And he didn't have as much experience dealing with First Nations in Quebec when he was in government there, or Indigenous peoples in general. And it was a learning curve. But over time, he put the time in, he gained the experience, and he was much better at the end than when he started. When I look at Mr. Carney, I'm looking at it the same way, is that this is the point he's starting from. But if this is where it ends, it's not going to be good. He has to actually invest the time and actually be able to invest that experience into it. Honestly, I think he's given his personal background, where he was from, where he was raised, I would hope that he would be in a better position to help make that transition. But he has to put the time into it. It's one of these things that I think this is where his time out of the country has hurt him, because when you're the governor of the Bank of Canada, these are part of the considerations. When you're governor of the Bank of England, it's just not. So to me, he needs to re-immerse himself in that and surround himself with good people. And I think that will say a lot about this. But at the end of the day, it's really a matter of if he's going to walk the walk on this. And that is an open question at this point.
Now, one of the problems for the Conservatives, I guess, in the campaign is they've really wanted to get away from sort of the tariff issue so much and Trump, and talk more about some of the key things that they were focusing on before the campaign, like affordability, crime, these types of things. Now, of course, Trump paused his tariffs or some of them for 90 days yesterday. Do you think that might help the Conservatives maybe kind of get back into where they want to be and get back on focusing on some of the sort of domestic issues in the campaign?
They're going to try that, and I appreciate them making the effort. But honestly, even with what happened yesterday, everything was paused, but it's for 90 days. And okay, so 90 days, are we back on this roller coaster again? You know what? Is he going to read one bad tweet and then all of a sudden he's threatening 100% tariffs on something else somewhere else, right? I think that's the problem that the Conservatives, the New Democrats, really all the opposition parties have here, is that it's so unstable and so unpredictable. If you could tell me for sure that this issue was off the table for 3 months, 6 months, you could probably turn around and focus on that. The problem is that we all lived through the first Trump experience. We've got 3 months of comparison from Trump 1 to Trump 2, and we see that instability. So again, I don't think it helps, because it doesn't take away the issue. Because at the end of the day, you can't trust Donald Trump and his word and what he's going to do.
Unfortunately, I got to end it for time for today, but thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Fraser.
Up next, we'll talk to pollster Kito Maggie about Indigenous preferences in the 2025 federal election. Welcome back. The 2025 federal election has been an exciting one for pollsters. With an unpopular leader in Justin Trudeau, who is going on 10 years in office, the Liberals appeared dead in the water just a few months ago, trailing Conservatives by as much as 20 points. But with a new leader in Mark Carney and amidst tariff and annexation threats from U.S. President Donald Trump, the Liberals have moved into the lead and could form a majority government. Joining me today to talk about these numbers and where First Nations voters fit in is Main Street Research President Kito Maggie. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Right. So as we were talking in the lead up, have you ever seen anything such a dramatic shift going into an election?
No, it's amazing. I remind people that in the latter half of 2024, we started asking a question about voter motivation for the election. And the question was, what's your number one motivation? And by far, the number one motivation was getting rid of Justin Trudeau. It wasn't forming it wasn't a new government. It wasn't supporting Pierre Poilievre. It wasn't. So, and then when we cross-tab against past vote, we saw that it was over 90%, which means we knew as late as December that if Justin Trudeau left, that a lot of that past vote could come back. But even I could never have imagined that the second that it happened overnight, that would have, it was more, okay, it's accessible vote, but it's not necessarily, and yet that's exactly what happened.
Now, obviously, playing into that, of course, was the threats of tariffs and annexation by the U.S. president. But are you seeing any other issues? That has been the number one sort of ballot question in the campaign. Are you seeing any other issues, though, that maybe could affect the numbers significantly as we head into the sort of final couple of weeks here?
I think there's a number of issues that are what I call primary issues, and this is a pocketbook election. This is all economics. Number one, affordability, and it has been for quite some time. Number two is Trump and tariffs, and other issues like inflation, interest rates, and housing and rent affordability are also there. But that makes up over 95% of the top issues. All these other smaller issues, crime and safety, immigration, have fallen off in importance and are now secondary issues. And you know, on economic factors, Mr. Carney is seen as the best to deal with Donald Trump, the best to deal with the economy, with interest rates, inflation, etc. And so it's very hard. It's the perfect storm for Pierre Poilievre. He must be pulling his hair out.
Right. Yeah. Certainly, it wasn't the campaign I think they thought they would be fighting. Now, interesting thing too is the numbers have remained stagnant since it kind of started. Right. The Liberals have been running about 6 to 10 points ahead. Their numbers are distributing really well, so they could get could look like they could get a majority. But what could happen maybe still that would change these numbers? Maybe I guess in favor of the Conservatives or even bump up the NDP a bit as we go into the last stretch here.
I think there's sort of like a couple of events that and that being the two leaders debates, the 16th in French, 17th in English, both in Montreal. The bloc is very low right now, but for the Conservatives to have a chance at winning, they need the bloc to increase. That means Blanchette, Pierre Poilievre need to dominate that French debate and try to pick up some of that vote in Quebec. The Liberals are leading overwhelmingly right now in Quebec. The bloc has dropped off. Even if the bloc can come back and claw back some of that lead, say 10 points, that suddenly caused a 4-point shift nationally down for the Liberals. And then the next day in the English debate, both Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh need to perform very, very well. I remind people that in 2019, 2021 elections, Jagmeet went into the debates very low, performed very well, came out the back end 3 or 4 days after the English debates, doing much better in the polling, saved the furniture. He needs to do that. But if the NDP, imagine right now in our polling, I think it's around 8%, but averaging around 7 to 9 in most polls. If they suddenly return to their historic norm of, say, 12 to 15%, and that's low for them, but that's 1-for-1 off the Liberals. You combine those two shifts, the one in Quebec, the one in the rest of Canada, and suddenly you could have the Conservatives leading by 4 or 5 points, and that's their path to victory. Very unlikely for all those things to happen, but they're still out there.
Right. Now, of course, one of the things of interest to us is that you do track First Nations voters. And I guess for our viewers to know, that includes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit voters, I guess, you put into the group. Yeah. What are some of the differences you've noticed there in the tracking of that particular segment? Yeah,
well, the NDP is doing much better in that segment. They're not leading, but they're almost at 20%, which is sort of what their historic number is across the board. And the Conservatives are actually leading, or it's about a statistical tie, but leading the Conservatives among First Nation, with the Liberals in second, the NDP doing much, much better than they do in any other segment. And that's largely Western Canada, meaning Manitoba all the way out to BC. And that community is supporting the NDP and Jagmeet Singh in much bigger numbers than they are in any other category.
Right, and why do you think that might be? The NDP really has been kind of squeezed out in this election. They're not being talked about much, and there's a lot of their vote obviously has went to the Liberals. What do you think that is the difference with Indigenous voters?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors there. I can't help but think there's a Wab Canoe factor. Certainly among voters in Manitoba, he's very, very popular. But he's also, he's been getting along very well with the Liberals and Trudeau, and since then with Carney. So I think there's some of those NDP premiers and strong NDP leaders in Western Canada that's making a big difference, especially in those rural communities where the First Nations is going to be a factor in those ridings.
Okay, well, unfortunately for time purposes, we'll have to end it there, but thanks very much for joining me today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Up next, we'll talk to Suzanne Obiora, the CEO of the Somerset West Community Health Centre, about the organization's decision to close its supervised consumption site. Welcome back. Ontario's Ford government has passed legislation that bans supervised consumption sites if they're located within 200 meters of schools and daycares. Nevertheless, a recent court injunction says these sites can remain open for the time being. There is a supervised consumption site located in downtown Ottawa at the Somerset West Community Health Centre, but the decision has been made to close the service down. Suzanne Obiora is CEO of Somerset West Community Health Centre, and she joins me in studio today to talk about this decision. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
Right. So I guess for our viewers that aren't know what a supervised consumption site is, maybe you could just explain what it is, I guess, and some of the clients that would use it.
Yeah. So this is a place where people are able to come and use substances under supervision. They can use it safely. But what I would also say, it's a place where people can access a number of programs and services, healthcare, connection to social support, and probably the biggest advantage is community connection. Many people are using substances for a variety of reasons, and oftentimes it's as a result of traumas they may have endured. And we've created a space not only where people can use safely if they were to experience an adverse event, but they're also able to connect.
Right, and one thing that many people may not know that don't follow this closely is there's a very serious toxic drug supply on the illicit market problem. How severe is, or how big is that problem that's out there?
It's a life and death issue. Supervised consumption sites have been able to reverse over 28,000 overdoses. At the Somerset West Community Health Centre, last year, we were able to reverse close to 500 overdoses. There is a drug supply that is unregulated, that is unknown, that is poisonous, that's leading to tremendous challenges from a health standpoint, from a behavior standpoint. It's causing brain injury. And yet people are still in a cycle where they're needing to use. So it's a very difficult time where people are seeking support and help amid a crisis that is life and death with the toxic drug supply.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction, but there was, of course, this court injunction basically that the supervised consumption site could stay open there, but you decided to close. Maybe you could explain a little bit about why your organization reached that decision.
Yeah, and I will say that it was the provincial government that asked us to close, and our services are funded by the provincial government. Now, there was an organization in Toronto that filed a human rights charter challenge, which led to this injunction. And I think, organizations who have the opportunity to stay open is great. Our reality, though, is that we are provincially funded. And so this injunction does allow organizations to stay open. They still need funding to operate. And the other piece to that, when we were asked to close, we were invited to become a homelessness, addiction, recovery, and treatment hub, which is also provincially funded. Immediately after this injunction was placed, we did hear from the province, that consumption sites who would transition to a heart hub would lose their funding should they attempt to continue operating as a consumption and treatment service. Our priority is serving our community, and we are requiring provincial funding in order to do that. And so what we hope to do over the course of the years is not only implement this heart hub, but to continue to work with the government to think about, what's possible in terms of reintroducing consumption and treatment services. We know it's a critical component to anyone's substance use health journey.
Right, and when would this heart hub be opening?
So we launched on the 1st of April. I should take a step back to say that we learned that these consumption and treatment sites would close in August and had been asked to start preparing to transition to a heart hub to open on the 1st of April. Now we've been working with many community partners in an effort to achieve that and have a plan to phase in the full model of this hub, which looks at social supports, it looks at primary care, access to health care, physicians, nurse practitioners, social work, access to employment supports, and what we're really excited about is the access to permanent supportive housing. So over the course of the year, we will be phasing in a number of these programs and services to members in our community who are ready to start having conversations around recovery in whatever way that looks like.
Now, of course, when you started the supervised consumption site, you knew that there was a school nearby. You knew what was there. Was that ever really a problem, or was it something you'd already accounted for in your planning anyway when you had the consumption site?
Yeah, so I will say that the reason why a supervised consumption service was initiated at Somerset West is because that community had the second highest level of drug overdose deaths in the city of Ottawa and the second highest level of blood-borne infections from substance use in Ottawa. So there was a need. And this was a service in response to that need. There was an incredible amount of community engagement to talk through what a supervised consumption service could look like in that community, and has been ongoing community engagement to talk through how best can we serve our community. So we don't lose sight of what the needs are and look at ways in which we can respond with increasing our outreach supports, with increasing support that we might offer to residents and to businesses. And I think it's just so important for us not to lose sight of this broader conversation around access to supportive housing, access to sufficient and adequate housing, and access to healthcare, all of which are components to this crisis that are critical all of which are important for us to address this crisis that we're living in.
Okay, well, fortunately for time, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks for talking to us about this important issue.
No, thanks very much for having me.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.